Or at least I thought I did, but it didn't happen. So this is take 2. We're going to see how it goes.
So what's our language?
We don't any other time. So first a couple of announcements, commercials, whatever. So this is the second of 3 mini-series, I guess we can call them, that we're having over the summer. In June, we talked about some of the other forms or sects of Christianity that were rejected by the group we called the Proto-Orthodox. So we talked about the Gnostics and the Ebionites and the Marcionites and the Montanists and all of those people. Okay? This week and next we'll be talking about Israel in the 1st century. So Israel in the time of Jesus. What was going on in terms of economy, religion, politics, all kinds of things like that. And then next month, on the 14th and the 21st, we'll be talking about some of the Gospels that never made it into the New Testament. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the Gospel of Judas. And, these Gospels were considered Scripture by some, but not all Christians. As we know, in the first couple hundred years of the Christian era, there was no Bible. There was no agreement as to what truly was Scripture and what wasn't. So we're going to look at some of the books that never made it into the Bible. And then in the fall, we have our schedule lined up. So in September, it will be on Wednesdays, same times, 9:30 a.m., 7 p.m., right here. And our topic for September is going to be the prophet Isaiah. Okay, who is, really the prophet that most of us know something about. Okay, so that's in September. In October, I'm going to spend 3 weeks, and I don't know which 3 Wednesdays they are, but we'll be talking about 3 of the minor prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are considered the 3 major prophets, but then there are 9 other minor prophets. So I'm thinking right now, I haven't thought of this for sure, but I think the 3 that I'm going to talk about are Amos, Zechariah, and our buddy Jonah, because his story, I think, is absolutely fascinating. The story of Jonah. The guy got swallowed by the whale, or the fish, or whatever that thing was. And then in November, continuing the theme of prophets and the prophetic, the prophetic movement. And this is something that Father Bill wanted to focus on for the fall. We will be talking about the prophetic role of the laity as it is articulated in the Second Vatican Council. So Isaiah and the minor prophets are kind of a prelude to our role. Every one of us has a role as a prophet in Christianity. And so we'll be talking about that. Okay? Is the recording still on?
It is, and
it
I'll
still
double
working?
check since you're really
Thank
going to
you.
get serious.
Appreciate that. Okay, very good. We lost it this morning, so
I'll keep looking.
I'm just nervous. So anyway,
We're going to crop now, so it'll stay on.
okay. It has to. I don't want to do it a 3rd time in front of nobody. So these are my primary sources, not the only sources that I use, but these are the primary ones that I use. So this one is called The Jews in the Time of Jesus by Stephen M. Weiland. I'll leave these up here, and the easiest way, if you were interested in them, the easiest way to write them down is to take a picture of them. Okay? So you can do that during well, there is no break, but you can do that after we're done. What break? The second one is Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium by Dr. Bart Ehrman. Third one is the book Zealot by Reza Aslan, which some of you may have read. this book is really good for the information that it provides about first century Israel, even though I don't agree with his primary premise, which is that Jesus was a zealot who believed that God would overthrow the Romans through the use of violence. I don't agree with Aslan. And then the last one is, this is the thick one, it's called The Birth of Christianity. And it's by John Dominic Crossan, who is retired now, I believe, but who taught for many, many years at DePaul University in Chicago. So I'll leave these up here, and feel free. All right, so first century Israel. Let's begin with just some real basic things, like the geography of Israel. All right? So Israel, the size of Israel kept growing and shrinking over the decades and over the centuries, depending on their particular, their level of power, or depending on who was controlling them. So in the first century, Israel, and when I say Israel, I mean, the area called Judea, Samaria, Decapolis, the 10 cities, and Galilee. Okay, so I mean all of this. It was roughly the size of the state of Maryland. Not very big. And so it had about 12,400 square miles. And its population, this is estimated, was somewhere between 500 and 600,000. All right? Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, covered 425 acres, which is 0.7 square miles. Not very big. I looked at a map of the city of O'Fallon, Illinois, yesterday, just for comparison's sake. O'Fallon, Illinois is 15.4 square miles, so much, much bigger. When you look at the configuration of O'Fallon, there must have been like 50 or 60 annexations, because there's all these this little subdivision, that little subdivision, right? Is that the way it grew? Yeah. Yeah. So it looks like a gerrymandered congressional district is what it looks like. So anyway, so the population of O'Fallon is about 29,300. The population of Jerusalem was about 40 to 50,000. So the population density was much greater at that time. All right, so Galilee, where Jesus came from, was roughly 2,100 square miles. One thing to keep in mind about Galilee is that after Galilee comprised a good portion of what had been the ancient kingdom of Israel. Recall that after the reign of Solomon, so around the year 922, 921, give or take, the kingdom of Israel split in two. So there was the kingdom of Judea and the kingdom of Israel in the north. And so the Assyrians, not the Syrians, but the Assyrians, who came from what is now northern Iraq, conquered the kingdom of Israel around the year 721 and brought the people of Israel into exile. They depopulated what was by this time Galilee. So Galilee was unsettled, uninhabited from that time until about the year 200 BCE. So for a period of over 500 years, it was depopulated. And it had just begun to be repopulated around the year 200.
And Mark, when you say depopulated, you mean nobody or just no Jews?
Basically nobody. I mean, I'm sure there were a few stragglers, roaming around, but no, it was completely uninhabited, which is interesting. I did not know that until I started preparing for this. Yeah.
And then when they repopulated, was those different peoples, or people come back from their exile? That's a good question. They were not held in permanent exile. So I'm not exactly sure where they went. But these were
the Jews from the north, the Jews from Galilee, were not the same as the Judean Jews. The word Jew itself actually is a shortened version of Judean, so they were the people from the south. I would have to look that up. I believe at least some of those people were the folks who had been there before. Okay? And why they were allowed to go back in 200, I don't know. All right? So I have homework to do. Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, and where some of the scholars say he was born. Just saying. Okay? In the time of Jesus, Nazareth was quite small. Its population was somewhere between 200 and 400. Very, very small, only one gas station. And there was no public architecture in Nazareth. What do I mean? There was no synagogue. So in tiny villages like that, people would meet in somebody's home. No surprise then that early Christians who were, also Jews, met in somebody's home. There was no Roman gymnasium. There was no fortress. There was no need for a fortress. And there were no paved streets. Okay, so it was, quite primitive. I did find out that the houses, and this probably would have been typical of the small villages in Galilee, they were quite modest. They were made of stone, and the mortar was made either out of mud, clay, or manure mixed with straw. I would have opted for mud or clay myself. And they had thatched roofs. There were usually holes dug in the ground, one to try to find water, and the other one for storage. Okay? And I would suppose, too, they didn't say this, but I would suppose they would dig a hole for whatever refrigeration there might be as well. Because, under the ground it's a little bit cooler. And some homes were actually connected to caves. They were just extensions from caves. So, pretty primitive. All right. So, some characteristics of Jewish society in the first century. First thing to know is that Israel, and when I say Israel, I mean Israel, Samaria, Galilee. This whole area had not been independent for most of the last 600 years. Okay, so the people of Israel and Judea had been under foreign domination for most of the time since this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom in 586 BCE. Okay? So when the Babylonians conquered Judea, they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Okay? So, just like the Romans did, they carried off, the Babylonians didn't take everybody out of Judea. They took the people who would have been most useful to them. Artisans, intellectuals, people like that. And so there were people who stayed behind. You get the impression that everybody left. That's not true. Not everybody left. And it's also true that there were a number of people who didn't come back. When the next guy, high-tech display here, when the Persians under King Cyrus the Great conquered the Babylonians roughly 50 years later, around the year 536, Cyrus let those who wanted to go back. Not all of them did. And so Judaism, or the presence of Jews in Babylon, continued pretty much uninterrupted for centuries afterwards. So there are actually two Talmuds. The Talmud is one of the books of interpretation of the Torah that Jews still looked to. There was a Babylonian Talmud, and there was also a Palestinian Talmud, okay, which indicates clearly the presence of Jews in Babylon well after the time of Cyrus and the Persians, okay. Cyrus, who is in the scriptures referred to with the term Savior, allowed the people who returned to rebuild the temple. He didn't think the temple was particularly important, although it was extremely important to the Jewish people. Okay? This begins around the year 515. That era of Judaism known as the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period lasted from 515 or so BCE until the time when the Romans destroyed the temple again in 70 CE. Okay? And after that time, the temple was not rebuilt. And as you who have been there, and even those of us who had not been there know, all that's left now is the Western Wall. Okay? So, once the temple was destroyed, it was never rebuilt. So, the Persians then ruled over the people of Israel and Judea for roughly 200 years until they were conquered by the Greeks and the famous Alexander the Great around the year 322 BCE. Okay? The presence of the Greeks was extremely influential. Greek culture became very important not only in Judea, but throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans, for example, were just enamored of Greek culture. The Egyptians were deeply influenced by Greek culture. One of the early schools of theology in the Christian world was at Alexandria in Egypt, and but it was the theology was heavily influenced by Greek culture. Christian theology in general, I'm jumping ahead, but Christian theology in general became deeply influenced by Greek culture, in Greek philosophy, in particular the philosophy of the Stoics and the philosophy of Plato. So the God of the Creed is as Platonist as he is Christian. I mean, as he is Jewish. Okay? That shows how deeply influential Greek culture was. Around the year, just to show you a sign of the influence of Greek culture, around the year 200 BCE, it was decided that the scriptures, which were in Hebrew, needed to be translated into Greek, because so few people, so few Jews could actually read the scriptures in the tongue in which they were written. And there is a legend around the formation of the Greek Old Testament, the Greek Hebrew scriptures, known as the Septuagint. The legend goes like this, that there were 70 scholars, each one sent to his room or his office or whatever. Each one kind of logged on to his own computer and translated the scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. And miracle of miracles, all 70 of those translations were exactly alike to the syllable. Wonderful. I mean, man, that's a sign that it was the real deal, right? So anyway, that's the legend of the formation of the Septuagint. Okay, after that time, well, Alexander died suddenly about a year after he conquered let's call it Palestine. And so there were Greek families, two competing Greek families, who continued to, fight over Palestine for about 120 years. So the one family were the Ptolemies. There they are, handsome devils, and they never ruled from Jerusalem. They ruled over Palestine from Egypt. That's where they were from. There was a guy named Ptolemy, and there was another Greek whose name was Seleucids. Both of them were Macedonian or Greek generals who were successors to Alexander, and they competed with each other to control Palestine. So you had the Ptolemies, and then you had also you had the Seleucids, and this guy Antiochus IV Epiphanes was one of the Seleucids, and I bring him up because it was under him that the Jewish people rebelled and were able to take back control of their own land, at least temporarily.
Where was he from?
He was a Seleucid, so he was from... You got me. I don't remember exactly where he was from. He may have been from Greece. He may have been from Egypt. It's on the video, so I'll when I look at the video, I'll remember to look it up. Okay. Anyway, he was a member of this clan, this Seleucid clan. He, being a very humble person, decides that he is divine, that he is a god on earth, and so he makes the attempt to stop the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. That was a mistake on his part. Okay, so the Jews respond by engaging in guerrilla warfare, and this warfare was led by a guy named Mattathias of the Hasmonean clan. And he and his sons, Simon and Judas, they won. And these guys are referred to as the Maccabees. So Judas Maccabeus, who is one of the more well-known of the Maccabees, had, I think, one of the best nicknames in history. His nickname was the Hammer. Wouldn't you love for people to refer to you as the Hammer? Wouldn't that be great? Teresa the Hammer. I mean, wouldn't that yeah, maybe that is your nickname.
Ann thinks it is.
Okay, all right.
I'm not saying a word. I'm the nail.
Enough said, Ed. Enough said. So these guys from the Hasmoneans actually were able to rule over Palestine for about a period of 100 years or so. Okay? And they served both as kings and as high priests, remembering that political leadership and religious leadership are one and the same pretty much at this time. There is not, the idea of church and state separation comes much, much, much later after this. So, fast forward to the 60s BCE. Now, some of the descendants of Mattathias and Judas and Simon, each one of them wants to control. They want to be in charge. These two brothers, whose names are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, each one of them wants to be king. And so, both of them go to the Romans so that the Romans will be on their side and help them defeat the other. The Romans, hedging their bets, pledge to help both sides. And so the general Pompey, he sees this is his perfect chance. So he just takes over the whole country. He defeats both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus and establishes the reign of the Romans in 63 BCE. Okay, so at this time, Palestine becomes a Roman protectorate. All right, and as we know, the Romans were in charge of Palestine at the time of Jesus, and the Romans were one of Jesus' enemies, one of those who needed to be done away with, needed to be cleaned out. Okay, so the Romans. There's Judas Maccabeus. There's the hammer. Forgot about him. So Caesar Augustus is, in 63 BCE, Rome is not yet an empire. It is. It's still run by more than one. It's a republic. It is officially run as a republic. So there's more than one chief leader. That ends in 31 BCE when Caesar Augustus, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, whom we know, he becomes. He declares the end of the republic, and he becomes the emperor. And in so doing, he also wants to be considered divine. He wants to be considered a god. Okay? Yeah.
Was it around this time that the temple underwent a major restoration project?
It did, but it was under the auspices of Herod. I'll get into that because I'll say a few things about Herod. Yeah, but during the reign of Herod, which was like from 37 BCE to 4 BCE, right about the time that Jesus was born. During that time, that's when the temple was rebuilt. Yeah, I'll get there. I'm not there yet, but I'll get there. Okay, so the high priests, the temple priests, see that it's better to join them rather than to fight them. It's better to join them rather than to beat them. And so they become allied or cooperate with the Romans. Okay? And that keeps them, at least nominally in power, but actually, they have no real power. There is still a Sanhedrin, but it does not have a lot of authority. The authority belonged to either the king or to the Roman governor, or to, the authority came from the Romans, not from the Jews. Okay. So how did the Romans exercise their authority over the Jews? They were not very kind. Let's just put it that way. Okay, they sometimes were tolerant of the Jews and their beliefs, but at other times were not. They occasionally tried to make the Jews worship the Roman gods. Okay, which would drive the Jews crazy and lead them to retaliation, either violent retaliation or non-violent retaliation. Both kinds. Okay? Another thing that the Romans did after they got to be in charge was they saw an opportunity to use the rich farmland, such as it was in Palestine, to further their trade throughout the empire. And so this is what they did. And this has a connection with the Jesus movement. So the primary occupation of Palestine was subsistence farming, family farming. So people would, farm their 3 acres, 2 acres, 1 acre, half acre, whatever it might be, and grow enough food to feed themselves, and maybe to bring a little bit to the farmer's market, But that was about the extent of it. Well, the Romans began a program where they would heavily tax the land upon which these farmers lived. And eventually, many of them had to foreclose because they couldn't afford to pay the taxes. Their land went to the Romans, and the Romans transformed the family farm system, the subsistence farming system of Israel, into a commercial farming area. And so they would grow olives and grapes and they would send them from Caesarea, which was Caesarea was built by Herod, and I just lost it. Caesarea, where did you go? Oh, there it is. So he built, as I'll explain a little bit later on, he built a port city there, some of which still exists. And he did that in order to send, the grapes and olives that were grown on these now commercial farms to other parts of the empire, and also so that other goods from around the empire could be sent to Caesarea. Why do I bring that up? I bring that up because, if you think about it, at least some of the people who were dispossessed, who lost their farms as a result of the Romans, were part of the Jesus movement. They wandered with him because they had nowhere else to go. Now, the size of his movement is unknown. We sometimes picture in the movies all these, hundreds and thousands of people. It probably was not that many, but at least some of them were very likely these people who had been dispossessed from their family farms. So what does Jesus say? Part of his message is, don't worry that you don't have your property. Don't worry about those things. The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, right? That message was a message to these people to place their trust not in their possessions, not in their farmland, but to place all of their trust in God. Okay? That's why that particular thing was relevant. Okay. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is that Jewish society at this time was quite cosmopolitan, because Palestine was kind of the intersection of a number of different trade routes, some from the west, from Rome, from Greece, from North Africa, from Egypt, from the Arabian Peninsula, and even from India. There were many different cultures represented, and so these people were relatively worldly wise. Okay, they communicated with a number of different cultures. So even little Nazareth, even Galilee, where Jesus grew up, would have been the people there would have been exposed to a number of different cultures. All right. There are some scholars, although I must say it's only a couple of those that I've read, who say that Jesus may have been able to speak not only Aramaic, but also Greek, the Koine Greek in which much of the New Testament was written. Who knows? We don't have anything in Jesus' own hand, so we don't know. All right, so third thing, Israel was a peasant society. There was a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots in Israel. The haves constituted about 10% of the population. They were concentrated almost exclusively in the cities. The have-nots, or the peasants, subsisted mostly in the rural areas. They were out in the countryside. And there were huge inequalities between the two classes. It was this peasant class that was being exploited by the Romans. This next characteristic is something that doesn't get talked about, I don't think, nearly enough. And it's this, that Israel was a purity society at the time of Jesus. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that there were persons, there were groups, there were places, there were things, and there were times that were classified either as pure or impure. So some of the purity laws were connected to the kosher dietary laws. So there were certain foods that could not be eaten, certain animals that could not even be touched. You know, we all know about the pig. It was considered, or let me put it this way, the fat and the blood of certain animals was considered impure and not to be eaten. Other purity laws involved the human body. So menstruation, miscarriage, childbirth, the male semen, where all of those things were considered impure. And those things, in childbirth, for example, rendered a woman impure. Leprosy rendered someone impure. Death, corpses were considered impure. So now, let's relate that to the ministry of Jesus. Well, let me continue, and then I'll come back to the ministry of Jesus. So, generally speaking, to be poor was to be considered impure. Sinners were impure. To be a woman, not always, but generally speaking, made you impure. To be a Gentile made you impure. Now, when you look at that list, consider the people with whom Jesus spent much of his time. It's the same list, right? He spent much of his time with people who were considered impure. He not only reaches out to lepers, he touches them. Blind people, tax collectors, lepers, Samaritans who were hated, women. He spends time with women. He actually talks to them during the day, which you're not supposed to do. Okay? So you can see that one of Jesus' challenges to the people of his time, at least the way the Gospels portray it, was a challenge to the purity laws. Okay? Because in the reign of God, everyone is an equal. The fact that you're a woman or a leper or even dead does not make you any less than anybody else. So one of his challenges was to the purity laws of his own time. Does that make sense? Okay. What was the importance of the purity laws? Well, observing the purity laws for the Jews was seen as a preparation for contact with God, a preparation for holiness, so that if you were pure, then you were ready to be in contact, to be in contact with God. Does that make sense? Okay? So if you were impure, the quality of your prayer, the quality of your worship was inferior to those who were considered pure. Okay. So it was a purity society. It was a patriarchal society. We know that, right? The guys were in charge. So not only did the men rule, but the world was viewed through the lens of the men. Okay? Women were profoundly second-class citizens. There were exceptions to that. We will see that, and we already know, that Mary Magdalene was an exception to that rule. Mary Magdalene, it seems, some say that she was a quite successful entrepreneur. We at least know that she and some of the other women were able to financially back and support the Jesus movement. Okay? Which means they had to have a little cash in the bank, right? Or in the hole in their wall, or wherever they had it. Okay. the religious life of first century Israel. God, did I say something wrong? So, as I've already mentioned, the first century CE was the time that was a period of time known as Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism, I have said, started around the year 515 BCE. It ended with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE. So, the two, before I say that, keep in mind that Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of first century Palestine, of first century Judea and Galilee, was not Judaism as we know it today. The Judaism as we know it today is Rabbinic Judaism, which didn't evolve until after the destruction of the temple. And it was an outgrowth, Rabbinic Judaism was an outgrowth of the domination of the Pharisees in Judaism after the destruction of the temple. So the Judaism of the Pharisees evolved into the Judaism of the rabbis, okay? Which is the way Judaism still is today. So now, the two pillars of Second Temple Judaism were, as you might imagine, temple and the Torah. Torah and temple. So let's talk about the Torah first. What is the Torah? The Torah is actually an ambiguous term. It can refer to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture, but it can also refer to the Hebrew Scriptures in its entirety. The Torah was the foundation of Israel's worldview. It was the source of its ethical principles. It shaped Jewish identity, and it shaped the way the Jewish people saw the world. It was their most important narrative. It was the narrative that they believed to be true about them. So it contained their history such as they knew it. It contained the story of their creation, the story of the covenant with Abraham, the story of liberation from slavery in Egypt with Moses, the story of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, their wandering in the wilderness, and their settling in the promised land. Okay? The Torah was the source of their laws, both their religious laws and their civil laws. And so the Torah really was important. Now, the Torah did not become important to Judaism until after the time of the exile. Prior to the time of the exile, the primary focus of Jewish, what made you a Jew was your worship in the temple. Okay? That being said, worship in the temple was, Jerusalem is here. Worship in the temple is something that the southern kingdom always pushed. And if you look at the Deuteronomic source, the D source within the Old Testament, you will see this focus on Jerusalem. But the people of the north were not so committed to Jerusalem. They had their own shrines in Gilgal and Carmel and places like that. Okay, so their worship was more focused at the shrines which were probably originally Canaanite shrines. The people of the north were much more heavily influenced by the Canaanites. All right, but the people of the south always thought that true Judaism involved Jerusalem and the temple. So this was both a political struggle and a religious struggle at the same time. So, the temple. One of the authors that I read said that it's more accurate to say that Jerusalem was built around the temple than it is to say that the temple was built in Jerusalem. The temple was the reason for the existence of Jerusalem in the first place. It was the center of the universe for for the Jews. It was the navel of the world, the belly button of the world, because it was the umbilical cord that connected this world to God's world, that connected the human world, the earthly world, to the heavens. It was also considered to be God's dwelling place, the place where God actually lives. So the Holy of Holies, the Shekinah, was the place where God existed in the Promised Land, in the temple. So that's how important it was to them. And the temple was built on Mount Zion. Mount Zion, even though it's not even the highest point in Israel, was considered the highest point in the world. So that it was the closest spot to God in the entire earth. It wasn't, but, hey, that was the story, okay? All right. It was also, at the time of Jesus, both the religious and economic center of the Jewish world. So you might say that the temple was the Federal Reserve Bank of Israel in the first century, because the Jewish people paid their tithe there, and the tithe was an offering. It was really a tax, but it was an offering for the poor. But and this tradition continues in some of the countries of where Islam is in charge to this day, that there is a tax levied on the folks to take care of the poor. That tax was paid at the temple. Okay?
Mark, who wrote the Torah?
Well,
Where'd it come?
depends on who you ask. The traditional story is that the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Torah, which sometimes is referred to as Torah, was written by Moses. Almost all scholars who have studied those first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures will tell you that it was not written by one person. Nor that one person was not Moses. And, it would take me too long to explain all the things that are in it, but the best theory is that there are 4 different sources that are contained within what we call the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. And nobody really knows who wrote them. It's easier to talk about when they were written than it is to talk about who wrote them. Okay? So there was, you've heard of the J, E, D, and P sources. The Aoistic source, the Eloistic, the Deuteronomic, and the priestly source. The last of those is the priestly source. It is added to the Torah after the exile. But some of the earliest stories in the Bible come from the priestly tradition. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but let me give you 2 examples. So after the exile, Sabbath becomes very important to define oneself as a Jew. So how are we going to emphasize that for the folks? So how are we going to tell the folks that it's important to observe Sabbath? Well, the priestly source redacted or edited the first story of creation to say that God rested on the 7th day. So you have this back in the beginning of time, but it's actually something that's written in about the 6th century BCE. Okay? So it's important, whenever you're reading the Bible, I've come to the conclusion more and more that you have to look at what is being said, but you have to know when it was written, who wrote it, and why it was written. Okay, those things are very important. Otherwise, you're just going to look at it as like a linear story, and it's not that at all. Another aspect of the priestly tradition that you see in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, are the 10 Commandments. So at the time, so after the exile, the priestly class says it's very important to observe the laws that are contained in the Torah. So what they do is add to the Exodus story, redacting or editing the Exodus story to include the giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. So it's positioned within the 13th century BCE. It's written most likely in about the 6th century BCE. Okay? It's what I've referred to frequently as retrojection. Writing something back into the story to address something that's going on up here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it kind of throws off our barometer a little bit about what? You mean that really didn't happen? Well, as I've said on a number of occasions, there are a lot of things in the Bible that are not factual, but they're all true. So it is true that God gave the Jewish people the Ten Commandments. Okay, well, I mean, that's the truth of their faith. Did it happen the way it's described in the book of Exodus? Moving on now. One other thing about the temple was the place where the high priests exercised whatever kind of authority and control they may have had. Okay? And, when you think about Jesus overturning the tables, overturning the, cleansing the temple, as they say, why would he have done that? Well, he did that as a form of protest, not just against what was going on there. What was going on in the temple was the normal commerce, the buying and selling of the animals that were sacrificed daily in the temple. What he was objecting to, most likely, was the system whereby the temple priesthood oppressed the peasant class. That's really what he is objecting to, not just the everyday sale of animals and the commerce that went on there. It was the system that impoverished the poor and oppressed the poor that he was objecting to. Okay. So those are the two primary components of Second Temple Judaism. Another aspect of Jewish religious life during this time is that Judaism was divided into several different sects or denominations. Okay? You've heard these names before. One of them were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the more popular and the more liberal sect. And their set of beliefs were adopted over time and became part of, generally speaking, Rabbinic Judaism. Although, when you're talking about Rabbinic Judaism, I think its primary characteristic of Rabbinic Judaism, which doesn't come about until a couple 300 years after Jesus, is constant disputation, constant argumentation about the interpretation of the Scriptures. Okay? My friend and colleague Rory Picker-Neese, who's coming here to present with me on October the 30th, she and I, in the middle of a presentation one time, came to the conclusion, I think we were talking about the book of Jonah. I said, I think Christians are always, when they look at the Scriptures, they're trying to look for the right answers. And she said, yes, and we Jews are trying to ask the right questions. So, Judaism is constantly, interpreting, reinterpreting. There are multiple interpretations of one verse or even one word in Scripture. Okay? That's part of the fabric of Rabbinic Judaism. So anyway, where did that come from? Oh yeah, that came from the Pharisees. I was talking about the Pharisees. Let's jump back to the time of Jesus. Okay, so what were they noted for? One of the things that they were noted for was, as I just pointed out, the interpretation of Scripture, what was called the oral Torah. So what that meant was there were different Pharisees who would have a different interpretation of Jewish law. So the law says that you cannot work on the Sabbath. So one of the Pharisees might say, well, that means that you cannot pull your donkey out of the hole during the Sabbath if your donkey falls into the hole. But you could go to another, Pharisee, and he might say, oh, no, it is okay to pull your donkey out of the hole on the Sabbath because of, something that Moses said. Okay? So that's just the way it went. So they believed in this oral interpretation of Scripture, oral interpretation of the law, which eventually evolved into these massive books of interpretation, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and also the Midrash, the Midrashim, which is nothing but a whole series of interpretations by different rabbis. Okay. They also believed, the Pharisees also believed in bodily resurrection. So they believed that sometime in the future there would be a general resurrection and everyone would come back to life bodily. Now, guess who adopted that belief? Christianity did. Okay? It's in our creed, right? I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. So, general resurrection then would be followed by a general judgment by God. And the book of everyone's life would be read. This scenario is actually described in the book of Revelation, which we talked about back in May, I believe. Okay, so, this resurrection of the body, this general judgment, there's actually two books. There's the book of your life, and your life, and your life, and then there's the book that God has written, that in which God has said, you're saved, and well, I don't know about you, but so there are these two books, and if God judges you to be evil and not worthy, that is called the second death. Okay, and that's it. I mean, if you're destined for the second death, sorry about that.
That's it, you're done.
You lose. Okay? Where did they get this? Well, the Pharisees, I think, and this is me more than what I've read. Well, I've read a little bit about this. This came from the religion of Persia. Okay? And remember, the Jews were under the domination of Persia. I have to go back to Cyrus, okay, for a couple hundred years. The religion of Persia was known as Zoroastrianism. And, I mean, there are probably about 50 topics. I told the folks this morning, I don't know if I'm going to live long enough or whether any of us are going to live long enough for me to cover all the topics I'd like to cover. One of them is the Zoroastrian religion, because Zoroastrianism has a belief in one God. It was monotheistic. It had a belief in choirs or ranks of angels, which was adopted by the Jews, also adopted eventually by Islam. It had a belief in individual judgment. It had a belief in general resurrection at the end of time and a general judgment. All of these things that were taken on by the Pharisees and taken on really by Christianity, at least Catholic Christianity, come to us via Zoroaster.
Are there any of them around still, or something?
There are a few of them around. They were booted out of Iran or Persia at the time when the Muslims took over. So I used to teach world religions, and that's when I got on to Zoroastrianism. The last time I taught the class, about 10 years ago, the book said there were about 210,000 Zoroastrians left in the world. I don't know whether there's more or less now. And they're in India. They're no longer in Iran. They were booted out of Iran, but they're now in India. I actually knew a Zoroastrian family from Ferguson, Missouri. How about that? So,
do they consider themselves Catholic?
No. The Zoroastrians, that's their own.
Separate.
That's their own religion. but their influence, spread to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Quite influential. More, for being such a little bitty religion, it's had a lot of influence over time.
Well, the Persians had a lot of influence. The Persians had a lot of influence.
Absolutely, they did. Yes, and this is one example of it. Yes, yes.
Okay, Mark, I just looked it up. It says 190,000 to 124,000 worldwide.
190 to what?
To 124. Worldwide Zoroastrian.
Only 124 to 190?
No, 190,000 to 124,000.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
So that range right there.
They're disappearing, and they're in India, aren't they?
This is worldwide.
Oh, yeah. But I think the greatest number of them are in India. They're not in Ferguson. There's one family there, but that's about it, I think. Okay, so what else? The Pharisees also believed in ranks of angels, like I was just mentioning. What do I mean by ranks of angels? I mean the powers and principalities and all of those kind of things. Those ranks of angels that Paul mentions. That is a relatively late development within Old Testament Judaism. When you read about angels throughout most of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, when you see a visit by an angel, what the writer is really saying is that is a visit by God. Okay? But the tradition in particular did not have direct face-to-face contact between God and people. Why? Because if you saw the face of God, you would not live. You would die, right? That's not all the traditions. The J tradition, the Yahwistic tradition, in the Yahwistic tradition, God walks in the cool of the evening with Adam in the garden, right? An example of the E tradition is the burning bush. You can't see the face of God, but God appears in a burning bush, or He appears in a volcano or an earthquake, or through a visitation by an angel. So through most of the Old Testament, when you hear angel, think God. But at the very late in Old Testament Judaism and into New Testament times, the time of Jesus, you have this belief in ranks of angels, which is a product inherited, or an idea inherited from the religion of Persia. Okay? The Pharisees also believed in the possibility of conversion to Judaism. All right, so enough about them. Then there were the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the more aristocratic, the more priestly sect or denomination. These were the guys who cooperated with the Romans, by and large. And so they were not very popular among the rank and file, as you can imagine. Okay, they were collaborating. I'm not going to use the other C word that's become so popular these days. They were cooperating with the Romans. Their interpretation of the Torah was very strict. And they did not agree with the Pharisees about this oral interpretation of Torah. They did not buy that at all. They were originalists, if you want to use a constitutional term, okay? These are the words, this is what you do, okay? They rejected the belief in bodily resurrection, and they believed, like some Jews still believe today, that when you die, that's it. Yeah, that is the end. That life itself is the blessing. That's God's blessing. And be grateful for that. Live your life to the full, because when it's over, it's over. Okay?
Were all of their copies of the Torah the same? They transcribed them?
Well, somebody asked that question this morning too. The copyists of the Torah were better at it than the copyists of the New Testament scriptures. And I don't know why that's the case, just that they focused more on it. So there were copyists and scholars who knew how many syllables there were in the Hebrew Scriptures. And they knew which syllable was the one exactly in the middle of the Hebrew Scriptures. They could tell you, yes, they could tell you which word, and they could tell you which syllable was, exactly the middle one. Okay, they were numerologists, and they counted things like words and syllables and books and all of that type of thing. So their attention to detail was very good. On the other hand, the copyists of the New Testament Scriptures weren't so good. And so this is one of my questions to my friends who believe in literal inerrancy of the Bible. I tell them this: we don't have any of the original copies of any of the New Testament Scriptures, nor the Old Testament for that matter. We have none of them. The earliest copies of any of the New Testament Scriptures that we have are 200 to 300 years after they would have been written. None of the copies of the earliest copies of the New Testament Scriptures, none of them agree with any of the others. Every one of them has discrepancies in them. So the copyists felt free to add stuff, delete stuff, sometimes based on their own prejudices and their own faith. And sometimes they just made mistakes. There are literally thousands of copying errors in the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament that we have. So what exactly is the Word of God? What exactly are the words? My contention is we have no idea. We don't know. But then it doesn't matter. It's okay, because we have the basic faith in them. Also, and I pointed this out before, the earliest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament Scriptures they're blocks of text. There are no chapters and verses. Chapter and verse didn't come around until about 1,000 years after the time of Christ. They didn't write chapter 1 of the Gospel of Luke. They just started writing. There is no punctuation. There are no paragraphs. It is just a block. There are just blocks of continuous text. And it was up to the translators to decide where sentences started and ended. So it's hazardous. Okay, what we have is a real, it's good. It's good. But it's not perfect.
That would explain why it's so hard to read on Sundays, especially if it's Paul.
Well, Paul wrote some of his sentences are just impossible to understand,
With
aren't
no
they?
punctuation.
Are you a lector? Yeah. Some of his sentences are just so
Terrible.
They're so opaque. It's hard to know exactly what he's talking about. That's another series we could do, though. We could talk about Paul.
When you say there's all these mistakes, maybe I'm reading too much into the word, but I was thinking the only way you know it's a mistake is you have a baseline to compare it to.
Well,
there's not really a baseline. I see inconsistencies, but when you see...
that's really what I mean. That what is contained in this manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus, let's say, is not the same as this other text over here. What they look for is consistencies. So when I say errors, I just mean that they're not consistent with the general body of the text. Manuscript history is great. There's a book that Bart Ehrman, one of the guys that I use for this little series, wrote called Misquoting Jesus. And have you read Misquoting Jesus? And so you know about all of these things that I've just been talking about. Yeah, it's hazardous at best to say, here it is. This is the Word. Okay, so we just went from the Sadducees to the New Testament manuscripts. Okay, so they all, back to the Sadducees. So they also did not believe in divine providence. God did not intervene in the world. God was utterly transcendent. God lived in his heaven, and the things that happen on earth just happen. Okay? So God did not reward a good life nor punish the wicked. So there is no bodily resurrection. There is no general resurrection. There is no general judgment at the end of time for the Sadducees. And they did not believe in these ranks of angels, nor did they believe in conversion to Judaism. So you can see that Christianity was far more heavily influenced by the religion of the Pharisees than it was the religion of the Sadducees. I think that's clear to see. Okay, so who else? Another of these groups. Yeah, Tom?
Telling this truth, the Pharisees continued on after Jesus' time as the rabbis of the synagogues.
Yes.
And then did the Sadducees fade out because the temple was destroyed and their main job was to do sacrifice, and when that stopped, the Sadducees kind of faded away?
Yeah. They faded away after 70 CE because they had been, part of the temple priesthood, or part of the temple priesthood apparatus.
The Pharisees became the rabbis of the synagogues.
Yes.
Okay.
Pharisaic Judaism evolved into rabbinic Judaism, but not until the 300s or 400s. It took a while. That's another topic for, the gradual separation of Christianity from Judaism. It was not after the destruction of the temple. It didn't happen this way. It happened kind of like this way. It took a long time. Okay, the Essenes. So we've heard of the Essenes before. They were not a unified sect or denomination, if you will. They were a variety of groups that shared similar ideas. So you have John the Baptist and his group were, very likely Essenes. You have another group that were known as the Therapeutae. You have the Qumran community, which gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you have another group from Damascus who were, Essenes. So I even read one book that said that there was a group of urban Essenes, that they didn't all flee from the city, that there was a group of urban Essenes in Jerusalem. But I only read that in one book, so I like corroboration. And I've only read it in one place, so I'm not sure about that. So what did the Essenes believe? They were very, very strict in their interpretation of Torah. They were very hierarchical in terms of authority. They despised the temple priesthood, and they considered themselves to be the temple priesthood in exile. Okay? They practiced voluntary poverty, and they shared all of their goods with each other. Sounds a little bit like the Jerusalem community in the Acts of the Apostles, doesn't it? Has some similarities there. All the members shared in the community's work. All the members joined in worship and shared meals. They were extremely anti-Roman. Okay? They considered the Romans, and this is a quote, the forces of darkness. They believed that God was calling them to defeat the Romans. Okay? But they did not believe that God was going to accomplish this through violence. They believed that God would get rid of the Romans by their withdrawing from urban life and by living this kind of radical charity, this sharing of goods, this taking care of the poor and the widows and the orphans. That if they did that, the Romans would convert. Yeah, that this would convert the Romans, and that they would say, okay, it's, the land is yours, we'll leave. Quixotic? Who knows? I mean, so they, after the Jewish rebellion of 66 CE, they were all killed. They were wiped out. So we see nothing more from the Essenes after 70 CE. Then there's another group which really can't be called or shouldn't be called a sect or denomination, and that's the Zealots. So the word Zealots means really two things. So you know that some of Jesus' disciples, a couple of them were referred to as members of the Zealot party. That might be a retrojection, but in general, the Zealots were those who believed that Rome needed to be overthrown. And they believed that God wanted them to use violence in order to overthrow the Romans. They took up arms as part of the rebellion of 66 CE. They were successful for a little while until Vespasian and his son Titus went to take care of business. And then Vespasian was called back to Rome to become the emperor, and he said, Titus, just finish this thing. And Titus leveled Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, dispersed the Jews out of Israel to all over the empire, and actually changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. Titus wanted to destroy the memory of Israel from human history. That is what he saw as his mission. And it didn't work. He failed, but that is what he wanted to do. He wanted to destroy Judaism, destroy the land of Israel. And if you have been to Rome and you've seen the Arch of Titus in the Roman ruins, have you ever seen the Arch of Titus? That was built for Titus by Daddy, in appreciation for what he had done in destroying Jerusalem. So there you go. Yeah. So what else? All right, so you have the Zealots. Yeah, and the Zealots, like I said, participated in the rebellion, and they were all killed. Another sect, after the time, obviously, of Jesus, were the Christians. So the Christians were a sect of Judaism. Okay? Even though they were a tiny little bitty sect. This one author that I've read said that by the year 100, throughout the empire, there were probably no more than 7,300 Christian Jews. Christians. Okay? All right. This Jewish sectarianism really ended with the destruction of the temple. And it was after that time, as Thomas pointed out, that it was the Pharisees who kind of became the dominant political and religious people, even though they got dispersed throughout the empire, and that evolved into rabbinic Judaism. So Sadducees, the Essenes, they're all gone. All right. I have 10 minutes left. I'm on page 6 out of 12 pages, but some of this stuff I've already talked about. So let's talk about some of the examples of oppressive Roman leadership. The first one is this guy, Caesar Augustus. I said, I already talked about how he took, how he came to power after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony. After that time, he declared his own divinity, and he gave himself the title Augustus. His given name was Octavian, but he took on the name Caesar Augustus, and the word Augustus means one who is divine. He also was given the Greek title Sevastos, which means one who is to be worshipped. He took on other titles as well: divine, son of God, God from God, Lord, Redeemer, Liberator, Savior of the world. Okay? Another humble guy. He there are two words in Latin for God. One is Deus. That's the one that we're familiar with. Deus is an immortal God, someone who controls the world. Caesar Augustus was not considered a deus. He was considered a divus, D-I-V-U-S. A divus is a human being whose great service to the world earns him divinity, the gift of divinity. Okay? Normally, the title of divus would only be given to someone upon their death. Caesar said, I'm not waiting that long. Okay, I'm a divus now. And of course, Latin is one of those languages that has both masculine and feminine forms. And so the feminine form of divus is, you guessed it, diva. Okay? So Augustus's divinity was actually affirmed in 4 different ways. If you've read the Aeneid by Virgil, there's a story about it in there. I'm kind of cutting this short a little bit. In the Lives of the Caesars, written by a guy named Suetonius, there is another story about how Caesar Augustus became a god. On his own coins, he depicted his own divinity by adoption, how he became a divus, and then upon his death, the Roman Senate declared him to be a god. So there's 4 different ways that his divinity was affirmed. Now, let's talk about, as I promised before, Herod the Great. There we are. Another example of Roman oppression. Although Herod himself was a Jew, but he was appointed by the Romans. Herod came from a noble family, and he came to prominence very early in his life. At the age of 15, he expelled a group of guerrilla soldiers or bandits or whatever you want to call them who had been harassing the Romans. He drove them out. And so in 40 BC, he was given the task of taking back Jerusalem from one of the Maccabees who was still trying to, exercise some control there. And he won. Herod took back control of Jerusalem in 37 BC. And after that time, Rome gave him the title King of the Jews. All right. Herod was a cruel man. He did not tolerate any, as the nuns used to say in grade school, he did not tolerate any tomfoolery. Okay? As soon as he assumed the throne, he assassinated the entire Sanhedrin and replaced them with his buddies, his cronies. He even killed several members of his own family. Yes. He was successful in bringing a certain amount of stability to Israel, and because of that, he was able to undertake some public works projects, which were his way of kind of kissing up to the Romans, and also a side benefit was that they employed a lot of people. So he built some palaces for himself, one at Jericho, one at Masada, and a third one that I didn't know the location of, but it was called the Herodian. It's I almost went contemporary politics. Not going to do that. If I would have done it, I would have said that it was called Trump Plaza or Mar-a-Lago or something like that. But you knew where I was going anyway, so what the heck? So he also built, as I have mentioned, this port city of Caesarea. He named it Caesarea after Caesar Augustus. He named it to honor Caesar Augustus. It had a gigantic temple in it with huge statues of Caesar Augustus. He used a lot of Roman architecture there. He built this gigantic harbor, some of which is still there because the concrete with which it was built was so good, right? You guys have been there. This concrete has lasted over 2,000 years. That's a good. They should have built the second Bush Stadium with that concrete. Right? Might have lasted longer. The streets were laid out, the traffic pattern was such that you could hardly go anywhere without seeing a statue of Caesar or a statue of one of the Roman gods or whatever. They were constantly reinforcing their authority through the use of even their architecture. Okay? All of this fed into Roman theology and Roman politics. Okay.
Mark, how did they show worship to Caesar? Was it sacrifices, or what did they actually do to show worship to him?
Yeah, there were sacrifices, and
what kind of sacrifice? What was it? Do you know?
I don't remember whether they were animal sacrifices or not, or whether that was whether it was more along. I don't remember, Tom, or whether it was along the lines of the burning of incense or the offering of prayers or whatever. Okay, that detail escapes me at the moment.
Yeah, homework.
But everybody was required to do that. Everybody in the empire was required to do this, and of course the Jews didn't like that at all. But you could buy your way out of it if you paid a certain. You could buy a waiver to the worship thing. Okay. Indulgent. I didn't say that. What else? Somebody mentioned that or asked when the temple was rebuilt. It was rebuilt by Herod in order to pacify the Jews. I mean, in its heyday, the temple was a huge structure. Okay, if you see pictures of it from the 1st century. All right, so even with all of this, Herod was still hated. Not a popular guy. So when he died, the land was divvied up between his 3 sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. And neither of them was made king. They were made tetrarchs. Remember the beginning of the Gospel of Luke mentions these guys and that they were tetrarchs. But even that didn't work. By the year 4 BC, by the time of Herod's death, the Jewish people see an opportunity. When the king dies, there's some instability. That's your moment. That's your moment to kind of do what you're going to do. So there was a major rebellion. This rebellion was motivated in part by Jewish messianic expectations. They saw this as perhaps the time when God's sovereignty could be restored in Israel. So, according to the historian Josephus, who left us a record of some of the things that happened, and even a very brief reference to Jesus, he says that there was this guy named Judas, who, not that Judas, but a man named Judas who, and this is a quote, raised a considerable body of followers, broke open the royal arsenals, and, having armed his companions, attacked the other aspirants to power. That's the Romans, okay? So the Romans, using 21,000 troops, they were always into overkill. They put down the rebellion, and they crushed the rebellion in the way that they usually did. They burned the villages, destroyed the cities, raped the women, and enslaved the people. So they were there not just to put down the rebellion, but to teach a lesson. Don't try this. Don't mess with us, okay? It will not go well for you. All right. Jesus then is born right around the time of this rebellion. So if we're trying to understand what Jesus is thinking as he's doing his thing, as he is performing his ministry, this is very likely one of the things that is in his mind. And it's not clear whether or not he saw himself as the Messiah, although his followers certainly did. But it's very likely that he, like those who participated in the rebellion of 4 BC, believed that it was time for God and God's sovereignty to be restored in Israel. That it was time for the Romans to go. It's also possible that Jesus would have participated in the rebuilding of one of the cities destroyed by the Romans, the city of Sepphoris. I don't know if you guys ever went to Sepphoris. It's up in Galilee. But Sepphoris was only found, I think, like 50 or 60 years ago. Rediscovered, the ruins of Sepphoris. So because Nazareth was so small, and because Joseph and Jesus were artisans or carpenters, and there wasn't much work to do, it's likely that they would have gone the 4 miles, walked the 4 miles to work to rebuild Sepphoris. Okay, next guy. I promise I will finish soon. I promise you. I know it's late and we're between storms. Herod Antipas. This is one of the sons of Herod. I'll say just a couple things about Herod Antipas. He wanted to be the king of the Jews like his father had been, but he was just a tetrarch. So he was responsible for the rebuilding of Sepphoris. He, unlike Herod, paid more attention to the people of Galilee. Herod didn't really care. Herod Antipas did. So he rebuilt Sepphoris, which is right here, and Nazareth is right here. He also built the port, imitating his daddy. He built the port of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, named it Tiberias in honor of the next emperor, whose name was, well, you know, Tiberius. Okay? Great way to get in good with the old man, right? Okay, what else? Enough about him. Last thing, I will do this quickly. It is very important, but I can march through it pretty quickly. So, Jesus, I should say the Jewish people, by the time of Jesus, believe that it's time to get rid of their foreign oppressors. That it's time to restore the reign of God in Israel. Right? It's time to restore God's sovereignty. It's time to have a king on the throne like David of blessed memory, even though David was not all that great. And that it was time for God to send His messenger, the Messiah, to get this done. Where did all that thinking come from? That thinking came about as a product of two watershed eras of Jewish history. The first is the Babylonian exile. The second one is the time of the Maccabees. I have come to learn through the years that if you really want to understand a lot of the Hebrew Scriptures, a lot of the Old Testament, you have to understand how Judaism was retooled as a result of the Babylonian exile and the time of the Maccabees. So, what happened during the time of the Maccabees and afterwards? How was Judaism re-imaged? How was it rethought? Okay, so because of the polytheism of the Babylonians, the Jewish people become for the first time truly monotheistic. Okay, you can see, even though the Old Testament tries to give you the impression that the chosen people were always monotheistic, that was not the case. Just look at the different names for God in the Old Testament. Yahweh was only one of them. El, Elohim, Adonai. Okay, so all those are competing gods. You had Canaanite gods. So finally, after the exile, the Jewish people begin to worship this God Yahweh exclusively. Even I say exclusively, even that I say with an asterisk. Okay, but I'm not going to go any further than that. Jerusalem, in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, Jerusalem emerges as a place of great importance and meaning. So, being a good Jew meant worshiping or being faithful to God's city, Jerusalem. That was easier to enforce for these people than it was for these people who did not have the same affection for the temple. Because during the exile they lost their temple, there came to be a much stronger emphasis on law, on Torah. I've already explained how, this emphasis on law after the exile led to them putting the story of the Ten Commandments into the book of Exodus. Okay, all those years later. All right, so great focus on law. Okay. Yep, and I've talked about restoration. So this restoration of God's sovereignty by the replacement of a foreign oppressor with a king like David is known as eschatological thinking. It is the end of the era of foreign oppression, the end of the age. Eschatology, or the eschaton, only came to be understood as the end of the world, kaput, period, no more, in the Christian era. The eschaton in first century Israel was understood not as the end of the world, but as the end of the world as they had known it up until that time. The end of the world of foreign domination. Okay, so it's a new age. It's not the end of the world. That thinking only came about later. Okay, now the Maccabees. During the time of the Maccabees, what it meant to be a Jew changed once again. So, under the influence again of the Persians and also the Greeks, the Jews begin to see themselves as caught up in a cosmic battle. So they are fighting against their foreign oppressors, the Romans, on earth, or they're fighting against their foreign oppressors here on earth. And at the same time, there is a battle taking place in the heavens between the forces of good and the forces of evil. The forces of good being God, the forces of evil being Satan. Even Satan, the personification of evil, is a product of the Persians. It's a product of the Zoroastrians. Okay, so they adopt this. Okay, this cosmic battle is known as apocalyptic thinking. So you have eschatological thinking, you have apocalyptic thinking. Then there was this belief that because God doesn't always win, and God's people don't always win in this life, there evolved for the first time, and this is at the time of the Maccabees, there evolves this belief in life after death, an afterlife. Okay? So this appears only very late in Old Testament Judaism. It is something that is incorporated into Christianity. But notice that this life after death also includes the thought that resurrection is not an individual thing. That resurrection is a corporate reality. It is the resurrection of the nation of Israel. It is the resurrection of the Jewish people. Okay? The only place where you really see that clearly spelled out in the New Testament is in the Gospel of Matthew in the 27th chapter. So at the moment when Jesus dies, what happens? There are a number of tombs that open up, and people start walking out of the tombs. And the Sunday when Jesus rises, these people go around conversing with people in Jerusalem. That's the idea of corporate resurrection. So the resurrection initially referred to this resurrection of the nation of Israel when God's sovereignty would be restored. Okay, so one last thing. It's the last thing, I promise. And so it's almost time to turn off the camera, but not yet. Okay, so with this thought of immortality, with this thought of an afterlife, the idea of martyrdom began to become acceptable. Okay, and eventually it became not only acceptable, but something that was encouraged, okay, as a response to persecution. And we know that martyrdom became part of the Christian ethos as well. That martyrdom was something that was like either a test of faith, or eventually it became a sign of one's love for God. So there it is. Are there? I guess before you turn it off, are there any? That's all I have to say. That's more than enough. I know. So any final comments or questions or?
Could you see the theology of the corporate resurrection even during the Babylonian exile with the prophecy of Ezekiel and the dry bones?
Yeah, I would have to study that a little more, but it sure sounds that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because Ezekiel is later than the time in which it is written far after the time in which it depicts. Right? It's one of the last books of the Old Testament. So it may be, you could look it up, and if I remember, I'll look it up to see if it is a depiction of this idea of corporate resurrection. I have a feeling, though, it may also be a description of their restoration after the exile. Their, proceeding back to Israel after exile. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. You guys ask me questions I don't know the answers to. Once I have to leave the notes, I'm done.
Substitution.
Okay. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening.